It was supposed to be a break from everything: work, stress, the noise of the city. Just me and 3 of my closest friends, deep in the woods. We'd found this spot online, a secluded area far from civilization. Perfect, right? The first day was amazing. We hiked, set up our tents, and even laughed about how quiet it was. No cars, no people, just us and nature. By the time the sun set, we were exhausted. That night, I crawled into my tent, ready to sleep. It was so still, no wind, no rustling leaves. I remember thinking it was almost too quiet. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. Whispers. First, I thought it was one of my friends outside. Maybe they were talking or playing a prank. But the voices were strange, soft, like they were carried by the wind. But there was no wind. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the forest, the sound of trees or animals. But the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, clearer. It wasn't random noise. It was talking. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a conversation. Like someone or something was just outside my tent, whispering to someone else. My heart was racing. I told myself, just look. You're being ridiculous. So I unzipped the tent just a little. That's when I saw them. Shadowy figures, barely visible in the darkness. They moved between the trees so quickly, it was like they weren't solid. The air around me felt wrong, freezing cold, even though it was a warm summer night. And the forest, it wasn't just quiet. It was dead. No insects, no animals, just silence. I zipped the tent shut as fast as I could and curled up, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning came, I told my friends what I'd seen. I expected them to freak out, maybe even pack up and leave. But they just laughed. They said I must have been dreaming or hearing things. I wanted to believe them. I needed to believe them. So I pushed it out of my mind. We spent the day hiking and exploring, and by the time night fell again, I was exhausted. That second night, it was worse. Started the same way. The whispers, but this time they came earlier, louder. My friends heard it too. I could see it in their faces. They were scared. We sat around the fire, trying to act normal, but the voices were getting closer, surrounding us. Then we saw them, the shadows. They were back, but this time they didn't stay by the trees. They were moving closer. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the woods. Nothing, but the whispers, they didn't stop. They were inside my head. One of my friends yelled, "Let's get in the tents." But I knew the tents wouldn't keep us safe. Not from whatever this was. We didn't sleep. None of us. The shadows stayed just outside the firelight, circling us, watching. By morning, we didn't even talk about it. We just packed up and left. The whole drive home, I felt like we were being followed. Like those whispers had followed me. It's been months since that trip. I've tried to forget, to tell myself it wasn't real. But some nights, when it's quiet, I still hear them. The whispers. I don't know what we saw in those woods, but I know this. The shadows weren't just watching us. They were waiting. Have you ever heard someone call your name in the dead of night? When you were completely alone? I'll never forget that night. It's burned into my memory like a scar that won't fade. I went into the woods looking for peace, for solitude, for a chance to get away from the noise of the world. Instead, I found something that I can't explain, something that still haunts me. It started as a simple solo camping trip. I had been feeling overwhelmed with work, with life, and I just needed to get away. So, I packed up my gear, chose a remote national forest far from anyone I knew, and set out for what I thought would be a relaxing weekend. The drive was peaceful. The further I got from the city, the calmer I felt. When I finally arrived, the forest was everything I'd hoped it would be. Quiet, secluded, untouched. I spent the day hiking, exploring the trails, taking photos of the towering trees and the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy. There was no cell service, no distractions, just me and nature. By the time I set up my tent and started a small fire, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The air turned crisp, and the forest seemed to settle into a kind of stillness. At first, I thought the quiet was peaceful, but as the darkness deepened, it started to feel unnatural. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, seemed to vanish. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just overthinking things. I settled into my tent and turned off my lantern, letting the darkness swallow me. For a while, I lay there, listening to the faint crackle of the dying fire outside and the sound of my own breathing. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But these footsteps were different. They were heavy, deliberate, slow. They moved in a circle around my tent, crunching the dry leaves on the forest floor with every step. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that it was just the forest playing tricks on me. But the footsteps didn't stop. They just kept circling round and round, deliberate and unrelenting. Finally, I worked up the courage to unzip the tent, just enough to peek outside. I shined my flashlight into the darkness, my hand shaking so badly that the beam wobbled across the trees. But there was nothing there. No animals, no people, just trees and shadows. I zipped the tent back up and sat there in the dark, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. And then I heard it. My name. It was faint, almost a whisper, but I heard it clear as day. Someone, or something, was outside my tent, whispering my name. My blood turned to ice. No one knew I was out here. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. So how could anyone possibly know my name? I stayed perfectly still, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to run, to grab my gear and get the hell out of there. But another part of me was too terrified to move. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear, listening to the silence. Eventually, the whispers stopped. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired or stressed or hearing the wind in the trees. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I just wanted to get out of those woods. As I hiked back to my car, I felt like I was being watched. Every so often, I would stop and turn around, expecting to see someone or something standing there, but there was never anything. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back seat and got out of there as fast as I could. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Later, when I was back home, I did some research on the area. That's when I learned about the disappearances. Over the years, several hikers and campers had gone missing in that forest. No bodies were ever found, and no explanations were ever given. Locals had their own theories, though. They said the forest was haunted by the spirits of the lost, restless souls who wandered the woods, searching for someone to listen, someone to follow them into the darkness. I don't know what I heard that night. I don't know who or what was outside my tent. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear those footsteps. And every now and then, I hear my name. It was supposed to be a fun getaway, just the four of us, escaping the chaos of the city. We found this remote cabin online, deep in the mountains, surrounded by nothing but trees. No neighbors, no cell service, just peace and quiet. It sounded perfect. The drive was long, but we didn't care. The excitement kept us going. When we finally arrived, the cabin looked, well, rustic. The wood was weathered, the windows dusty, and the front door creaked like something out of a horror movie. But we brushed it off. After all, we weren't there for luxury. That first evening was normal enough. We unpacked, lit a fire, and spent the night playing cards and joking around. By the time we went to bed, the only sounds were the crackling of the fireplace and the occasional howl of the wind. But then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. Then I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the roof. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat. But the steps were too heavy, too measured. It was as if someone was pacing back and forth, right above me. I lay there, holding my breath, listening. Eventually, the footsteps stopped, but the silence was even worse. I wanted to wake the others, but I didn't. Instead, I told myself it was nothing and somehow drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I told the group what I'd heard. Ethan laughed it off, saying it was probably a tree branch scraping the roof. Sarah joked about the mountain ghost, but Danny, he didn't laugh. He didn't say much of anything, actually. He just looked uneasy. That night, things got worse. Couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they didn't stay on the roof. They moved, slowly, methodically, down the side of the cabin. And then I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, clearer. It was a low, murmuring voice, speaking words I couldn't understand. It was coming from outside the window. I wanted to look, to see what was out there, but I couldn't move. I was too scared. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and then silence. The next morning, Danny finally spoke up. He said he'd woken up in the middle of the night and seen something. A shadowy figure, tall and unnaturally still, standing at the foot of his bed. He said it didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching him. When he turned on his flashlight, it was gone. None of us knew what to say. We were all feeling it by then, that oppressive, suffocating sense of dread, like the cabin itself didn't want us there. We decided to leave. We started packing up, and that's when we found it. Scratched into the inside of the front door, in jagged, uneven letters, were the words, "Leave now." The scratches were fresh, the wood around them splintered. We didn't need any more convincing. We grabbed our things, threw them into the car, and drove away as fast as we could. None of us spoke on the drive home. We were too shaken, too scared. It wasn't until later that we found out the truth. The cabin had been abandoned for years before being listed for rent. The previous owner had vanished under mysterious circumstances, and locals said the place was cursed. I don't know what we encountered that weekend. I don't know what was on that roof or who or what scratched those words into the door. But I do know one thing. Some places are better left alone. Even now, I can still hear those whispers when I close my eyes, and I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did.